Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to my friend Rob Osler about his latest book. It's the case of the murdered muckraker. Rob is a USA Today bestselling author. He's won an Agatha Award, a Lefty Award, and another something Fisher Award. Sorry, I should have written that one down.
Anthony, not Agatha.
Anthony, all right.
And the Robert L. Fish Award, which is Mystery Writers of America Award for best first short story.
I love it. I love it. Congratulations on all of those, and so well deserved, Rob.
Oh, thank you. We do it. We do what we can.
Right. So we give the audience an overview of what your latest work is about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. You can kind of see them up there on the shelf. The series is a historical series set in the Progressive Era. Progressive Era, for those who aren't familiar with that term or the dates, maybe familiar with the term but not the dates, fair enough, is 1890 to 1920. Think that we're coming out of the Gilded Age, right, which is like 1870 to 1890. We're about 30 years past the Civil War, just to kind of give you some milestones there historically. So that's the time period. It takes place in Chicago, Illinois, which at the time was the fastest growing city in the world, America's second largest city, second to New York, as many of you would know or guess. And its population was about 1,700,000 people at the time of Book One, which is the case of the missing maid, which occurred in 1898. The series, Harriet Marrow Investigates, as that title might suggest. We've got a character named Harriet Marrow. Book One, and then I'll quickly pivot to a little overview of Book Two. Book One starts on Harriet's first day as a detective at the Prescott Agency, which is a fictional agency, but it's somewhat modeled after the very famous or infamous at the time, we can talk about that, Pinkerton Agency, which was also headquartered in Chicago, headed by the famed Alan Pinkerton, detective. Harriet gets a job as a lady detective, the first lady detective of the Prescott Agency, at the young age of 21, doing a favor for her boss, because she has no experience. She goes off looking for this maid of an elderly neighbor of Prescott's, really as a favor to Prescott's wife. And then the mystery occurs. She zooms around Chicago by bicycle and solves the crime. No spoilers there. The case of the murdered muckraker is book 2 in the series. It came out just 2 weeks ago. It picks up the following week. So this is now the start of week 3 of Harriet's detective experience. And as the title suggests, my titles are pretty suggestive of what you're going to get. We've got a murdered muckraker found dead in a tenement building. The tenement building is portrayed on the cover of the book. And Harriet is sent undercover because the tenements at the time were terrible, squalid living conditions. We can kind of go deeper on that if it's interesting. Filled with largely immigrant families, very distrustful as well. They had every right to be of authorities. So when a murdered white guy who seems to be of some means and privilege is found dead in the tenement, it's a very close-knit community and nobody's talking. Well, to get chins wagging and try to get the investigation going, Theodore Prescott of the Prescott Agency, Harriet's boss, sends her in undercover as a settlement house worker, to try to kind of ease the tension and become friendly with the women immigrants of the tenement building to try to kickstart her investigation and figure out why the muckraker was murdered and what he was doing in this tenement building.
I love it. That's a perfect setup. And it is. So, will you explain what the term muckraker means? Because I had envisioned one set of muckraker, and this is sort of a different set. So, tell us what the muckraker's job was to be doing there.
Yes, and if anybody is interested in this topic, hopefully you are. Um, 2 weeks ago, you can just Google crime reads. Probably a lot of your viewers are familiar with crime reads. I did a guest article in crime reads on muckrakers at the
Oh,
time.
good.
So muckrakers, as I described, were the OG investigative journalists. And the term muckraker was born and really defines that investigative journalist of the progressive age. So it's just like a perfect meeting for me, progressive age and investigative journalism, muckraker. Muckrakers at the time were really influential, as are, like if you think like Ronan, right, in unmasking the Me Too movement, it's like, he's a muckraker. He's an investigative journalist. So muckrakers at the time, there's several of them, and they have an amazing track record of exposing crime, horrible living conditions, political corruption, all sorts of societal ills, and actually affecting change. And I profile several of them in that Crime Reads article. One everybody will have heard of is Upton Sinclair, right? And The Jungle. He chronicled the horrible working conditions and the terrible immigrant living conditions of those who worked at what were called the Union Stockyards, or the yards south of Chicago, that was producing, like 4/5 of America's pork, lamb, beef, spread for miles in every direction. The most horrible working conditions you could imagine were exposed by Upton Sinclair, largely, not exclusively, and motivated a lot of change, and new legislation and rules and working condition codes and policies. So that's what a muckraker was at the time.
And I love that, because in reading this book, I understood where that term had come from. So I think for me as a layperson, a muckraker was somebody. So I believe that if you muck out a horse's stall, that's a muckraker as well. So I envisioned the person as being on the evil side, whereas really they were on they were evil to capitalists or very rich and wealthy and powerful people, but for the average everyday person, they were a godsend. And I think that, so you mentioned earlier that this book takes place just 30 plus years after the Civil War. And what I know in this country is we managed to replace slavery with immigrant labor very quickly. We imported thousands of Chinese people to build the railroad, and then we made all these laws condemning the Chinese and not allowing them to be buried and not allowed to be in certain neighborhoods, blah, blah, blah. We had sundown cities where if you were a person of color, you had to be out of the city by sundown. We had all these immigrants that came from especially Eastern Europe that, of course, by the 1920s and 30s, we were passing all these laws banning them from this country. And I find that this country has such, and maybe even what we're going through in today's world isn't so far different. I think conditions are much better for most of us. Most all of us have a phone. We know what's going on in the world, whether we want to know or not, because it's right there on every social media, on every news outlet. But I also think that this country has such a horrible track record at treating others differently. And Harriet is different. Harriet's a lesbian, so she's not accepted. And that's one of the things that in both the first and the second book that I feel like you do so well as an author to educate the public without hitting us over the head. So Harriet, I love the fact that she likes to wear men's clothes. And I think to myself, if you ever have to chase somebody, who in a right mind can chase in a pair of heels and a dress? I mean, you can't climb a fence with a dress on. I mean, you can, but you're going to be labeled something different than a private detective. Yeah. So what about Harriet? Yeah. So what about writing a woman was inspirational to you, Rob?
Yeah. So I'm going to answer that, but
All right.
You're emphasizing the immigrant impact at the time and in America. In I think it's so important. And let me just drop two statistics on you to really make this point. At the time in 1890, so that's 8 years before these two books, but
Okay.
close enough. In 1890, 60%. 60% of the Chicago population were immigrants or born of immigrants. Fast forward a decade to 1900, 3/4 of the population of Chicago is immigrant or the children of immigrants. And if you look at like the robber barons at the time, Carnegie and Steele, JP Morgan and finance, Gould and the railroads, massive wealth disparity, hello, billionaire class of today. We can talk about we've come so far and not really. But that is all enabled by immigrant population who were willing to do the work today, migrant farm workers or, pick whoever, construction workers.
That's right.
That the wealth and the middle class, right, benefited and was only enabled by the cheap labor and tenement conditions, pointing to Muckraker, of that time. For Harriet and her ability to do her sleuthing and be a woman, as I describe her, she's 3 times the outsider, right? And as crime writers, we like having that character who's the outsider, who's not only fighting the crime, but is also the whole conditions, right, of what they face. Because, we want to put them in a bad spot and just slowly turn up the temperature as you go.
Watch how they react in the hot water. That's right.
Right. And just, increase the stakes, increase the peril as you go. Well, for her, she's 3 times the outsider. First, she's just a woman in 1898, right? Suffrage doesn't even pass for another 22 years with the 19th Amendment. Right. That's actually I tackle that in book 3, the case of the swindle suffragist, where I go and talk about suffrage. And just as a quick side note, because I can't talk about suffrage without talking about Ida B. Wells, which may seem like a non sequitur to people, because it's like, wait, wasn't that a black woman at the time? It's like, yes, but she was a key muckraker, by the way, who had her own newspaper called Free Speech, which was actually in Memphis. It was in Memphis and burned to the ground by the Ku Klux Klan. That's a whole side note. But Harriet is a woman, outsider 1. Outsider 2, she's got the audacity, so the other men in the office think, as well as all the other women in the office, that she can do this job of being a detective. And then third, she is a queer woman, and I use queer woman instead of lesbian because lesbian wasn't even a term in the public vernacular. Lesbian was used by in the medical community. You would see it start to surface in about 1898. The first usage I could find was like 1896. Usually by in the psychiatry realm, right? Because they were trying to attribute this aberrant behavior of women, and they called it lesbianism, right? So Harriet is just like, I got these feelings, but there's no Will and Grace, there's no Queer as Folk, there's no the L Word, there's no nothing for her to model her desires and her natural inclinations and just who she really is. There's no place to model that. So so she's 3 times an outsider. I knew I was going to write a woman just because, my own personal background, and I would question anybody who says, no, I don't bring any of my personal background in.
Every writer does.
But even just the name Harriet Marrow, Harriet Pruitt was my grandmother. Vera Marrow was my great aunt. And my mom really represents the tenacity and the chutzpah and the pluckiness of Harriet. And growing up, I all my friends were not all of them. I had some ski buddies. I grew up skiing. But mostly I hung out with girls, and girls were my friends. I still have a lot of women friends, probably more women friends than I do guy friends. And so I was very comfortable writing a woman. And I was just at the San Francisco Writers Conference the other day, and I had this conversation. It's come up a few times because a lesbian came up to me afterwards. She didn't declare herself to be a lesbian, but sorry, we can tell sometimes as
yes, sometimes
queer and gays and trans folks.
right.
It's like, which is all great. And she's like, so I'm just curious though, like why did you write like a woman? And I was like, okay, well, here's why I wrote a lesbian. In 1898, I would not have, I wouldn't make the choice to write a contemporary lesbian, because as I look out at the city of San Francisco here, I don't know what the life experience of a 21-year-old lesbian in a big city is. I have no idea. I would have to do so much research, and then still people are going to look at my picture on the back cover of the book and go, what? That doesn't make any sense. You may still do that with a lesbian in 1898. But what I would challenge is nobody knows what a queer experience was in 1898.
That's right.
And you can read my pretty extensive author notes in both books that I made a pretty strong effort, I have to say, in researching at the time. But you still have to triangulate and say, okay, I'll take this on, that there was a Black Rabbit Club in New York at the time, but it catered to gay men. There was this, there was that. But, there's no authoritative, comprehensive account of, gay life in 1898, be it for gay, lesbian, trans people who I'm sure were racing around the streets of Chicago, but they weren't telling their story because that's
because they'd go to jail for telling their story.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that you've done in both books, that you've highlighted without preaching the fact that there are certain things that they can talk about, certain things they can't talk about. Of course, even in real life, there are certain situations in our personal lives, not about being LGBTQ plus, but just things in our personal life that there's only a select few people we can talk about, because we know that it's a delicate situation, and you've got to be able to trust someone. And I think, trust is that thing that everybody wants and hopes to get, but it's that one thing that is so easily lost or mishandled by someone else. So we have to be able to trust who we share these things with. And I thought, I think that's something that for Harriet, it is front and center in her mind every day of her life. And yet she doesn't let it dictate who she is. She knows what she's capable of, and she knows what she wants. And I love that about her. We don't see someone who's grappling with what she's capable of. She just knows what her limitations are in everyday life, what she's allowed and not allowed to do, and what line, if she steps across the line, she has to calculate the consequences in advance.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an astute observation on the trust element, because I felt in creating her secondary, in the secondary cast that surrounds her and gives her support, they don't all, it's some cases of tough love.
Sure.
But, I had to give her one colleague in the office who could be her confidant and actually help her, that she could trust, right? Because it's like as I've already described, she's 3 times the outsider. And if she is like her against everybody in the office, I mean, Prescott hired her, but really just kind of as a test and a curiosity, really. I had to give her somebody in the office. And then outside in the world, I gave her Pearl Bartlett as kind of a surrogate grandmother figure, because I just felt like she needed that nurturing. And also, just as this is kind of a crafty thing, an element of craft, is as I expand her interiority on the page and I try to write about what's going on in her head, I have to give her a space and a place that makes sense for her to do that, right? And so she can like be thinking thoughts all the time, but it's also interesting for me for her to have conversations with others. Well, as you say, if you know if there's very few people she can trust, she's going to have those conversations either with Matthew at the office or with Pearl Bartlett in her mansion, over some muffins. Pearl's an avid baker. And so it was key for me to like give her those people and those safe spaces where she could process and also just like talk about the job, right? We come home from work, from shitty jobs, and we're cranky, and it's like, I hope you at least have, I'm looking at our giant cat over there. I hope you at least have a pet, right? That you can just go, God damn. Because you come home and have those moments where even if you're being overly cranky, that there's some other sentient being, or even if it's a phone call, right? Where you can just go, I got to unload here for a moment and just listen to me for 5 minutes. And so I needed to give her those safe spaces.
And also those friends who can say, okay, Harriet, you're looking at this the wrong way, or what if it's this, because I think those friends that we have are just as valuable as those that listen without judgment. I mean, I think I need both in my life, because I'm a person who makes decisions very quickly. I'm very sure of myself. I may second guess myself, but you're not going to see me second guessing. You're only going to see me moving in one direction. But then I have to have a friend every now and then say, all right, Dan, cool your jets. You're off your rocker. You're headed down the wrong garden path. Don't go there, because it could be something as simple as this over here that I either chose to ignore or never saw. So I did like that, because I like, Matthew at the beginning. So Harriet is in heavy clothes and she's hot. Matthew's somebody whose office is freezing and hers is heated. And she asked him to help him open the window. And he's like, well, we both know you're stronger than I am. And I loved that, because it's just that little piece of humanity that we as the reader gets to see about Harriet's relationship with Matthew, and what you choose as an author to share from Harriet's voice. And I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate you picking up on that, because that is like those little things. And I'm sure like most other authors are like this. It's right. It is that intentional, right? That I want that to just be like, not a big deal, but it's just a little moment where I'm conveying something factual, that it's like, is Harriet like, I want you to imagine her and not forget that she is not a petite, slim, size 2.
She has stout ankles, according to her boss.
She's a husky. She's a husky framed woman, and that's who she is. And so Matthew's not like a twig, but he's just like, look, we know, I'm no stronger than you are. Right. And so it's factual, but then also it's like, he can say that to her. And Pearl is constantly saying things to Harriet, who she calls Harry, because she first mistook her for a man, and then it just stopped.
Yes, and that little bit of familiarity, though, Rob, that sits so well with us readers, because Pearl is friends with Harriet. She is when she calls her Harry in front of her boss. So it's one of those. It's one of those things that we see aside. And then, so without giving any spoiler away, was Prescott's daughter mentioned in the first book or only in the second book?
She was mentioned in the first book.
Okay. I did not remember her. But
a little bit I know at the end, because I felt like I had to. This might be a tiny spoiler, so I'm not going to say it, but I'll allude to it. I had to, in my mind, like make sense of Prescott's giving her a chance kind of thing. Right. Okay. I felt like I needed to like kind of, and hopefully then the reader will go, okay, that tracks.
Okay, which it does. I will say that, I just finished your book about 30 minutes ago. There are already things that if I don't make a note, I won't remember. I read for enjoyment, but I also try to pick up on if something is newly introduced or not. So.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, no. So
and
good.
I do. So I love what you do. And I will mention that I interviewed Ellie Griffiths about a book she said in 1850. And
Hmm.
she said to me on the podcast, she's like, Dan, who from 1850 is going to speak up and say I got it wrong? Which I think you said something similar about the missing maid. We don't know exactly what life was like. We only know what few things have been written down over the years and what we see in science. And I think, you're introducing the fact that the word lesbian came around in 1896 or whatever. I think that that's something that, we people so often want to put a label on others, or science always wants to put a label on anything because that's the way we recognize what that anything is. But
Mhm.
those labels sometimes have been harmful to certain people in society. You know,
Mhm.
Harriet is a human being who has human interest, and
Mhm.
she happens to like women. That's all. I mean,
Yeah.
we can give her a label, but it doesn't matter what that label is because Harriet shows us who she is, and I want Harriet on my side if I have to go to war.
Yeah. No. Awesome. Yeah. And just to hang out with, go on a bicycle ride around Chicago.
Right?
Yeah. Just on the historical thing, the one thing I will slip in is because one of my favorite things about writing this series is doing the research and just coming across stuff that you're like, what? Like, what are you serious? So I will say that, in Chicago, because there is a lot of documentation, on Chicago at the time. So if she is going to Turnverein, what's a Turnverein? It's short for, well, actually no, Turner Hall would be short for a Turnverein, which is basically a German gymnasium, kind of back to the immigrant point. Um, Tens of thousands of German immigrants, along with Irish and Poles, although Poland didn't exist at the time as the country we know it today geographically. But with the influx of thousands of immigrants, there were these things called Turner Halls, which were German gymnasiums. There were like 54 at the time with 5,000 members. Um, I bring this up because it figures largely in the book, but that is a historical fact and the kind of thing that I will research. And there's actually one Turnverein, Voiwerts Turner Hall, which still exists today. The building still exists, and Harriet is in there several times. So when I'm describing the exterior and it says Good Heil, across, in chiseled in brick, good health, all that stuff is historically accurate. And one of the challenges is, once you go to places like City Hall, and it's like, which City Hall?
Right?
Right? Because it's like things burn down, and then they
Right?
move, they expand things. So I have to find the right City Hall, or if she's crossing a bridge, was that a swing bridge? Depending on the level I'm giving, of detail I'm giving that bridge, I have to understand what state it was in, if it was under construction, was that bridge really there, and then do it in a way where you, the reader, you're not stuck on the kind of bridge it was. It was just there, and it's right. That's important to me. Back to the lesbian thing. Yeah, I mean, it's so discouraging that like the most in vogue term at the time was sexual invert, or sometimes shorthanded to invert, which is, talk about a clunky term. Homosexual was coming into the public vernacular at the late 1890s. Lesbianism, again, one of these crazy facts you come across. I mentioned earlier, it was in like the psychological journals and things like that, is where you'd see it crop up. Was attributable to three conditions. One was a female prostitute, or I'm sorry, two female prostitutes engaging in sexual activity for the entertainment of a man,
Okay.
or a particularly masculine, absurdly masculine woman subverting a weaker woman. Or my favorite, and this came through to me through my contact form on my website from somebody who'd read The Missing Maid and said, hey, in your author note, you didn't say this third one. And she pointed me to this really terrific book, Fierce Desires by Professor Rebecca Davis from the University of Delaware, who said, who not said, but did, tons of academic research, much on a much higher level than I'd ever even attempt, that it was attributable to an enlarged clitoris.
All right. All
right.
right.
And so, these are just things you come across and you just shake your head and you're like, but, fast forward to today and we're like, vaccines, are they really so
right,
good?
precisely,
So
I just, one of the things, Rob, and of course, in this, I love this book so very much. One of the things that it does remind me of is the preoccupation with society in naming something, curtailing something, making something legal or illegal, trying to see that someone else doesn't have access to something that would better their lives or their, knowledge or what have you. And that is something that disturbs me greatly. I remember, growing up in a very small community and how very small-minded some of these people were. And I just remember I remember when I was in the third grade, our teacher made us read a lot. And I learned to love reading. And I thank that teacher greatly, because without her, I might have been a lazy reader like both of my parents were. I am a voracious reader at this point in my life, and I'm very thankful for that, because reading is knowledge. If I want to go to Japan, I can pick up a book set in Japan. If I want to go to China, same thing. I want to go to South America or to Chicago, I can do that. I don't have to leave home, and it's free education.
Yeah.
But so your books are always thought-provoking and so entertaining. So on that note, I'm going to say the case of the murdered muckraker is yet another fine example of Rob Osler's excellent writing and excellent research. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Okay, awesome.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.